This is the story of a young man who, after years of being humiliated and bullied at school, ended up becoming the most powerful boxer of all time, and not without reason. He is capable of knocking down any opponent with just one punch. But to understand how it all began, it is necessary to know the tormented soul of Bike Sandru, a teenager who seemed determined to turn his own life into a nightmare. Even though he possessed a natural talent for boxing. Such was his talent that the world's best trainer, known only as K, the same man responsible for training 5 world champions, began to silently observe his abilities. Bike even trained with professional fighters, including a dark-skinned man named Steel. Even when facing an experienced fighter, the albino demonstrated impressive reflexes and strength, dodging with agility and landing firm, precise blows. Steel recognized that the boy possessed an extraordinary talent, a true gift. However, he made it clear that he still lacked experience. After being defeated, the professional admitted that he had only won because the fight wasn't a street brawl. Bike's performance deeply impressed K. After observing him closely, the coach concluded that the boy had the qualities of a champion. However, before he could approach him with a proposal, a noise caught his attention. A street fight. To his surprise, the protagonist was involved. Yu's cold, empty gaze sparked an immediate interest in K. It was as if the boy could predict every blow before it was even thrown. Without thinking twice, the coach rushed to intervene. When the aggressors were subdued, he asked Yu why he hadn't dodged. The boy realized that the old man was the first to recognize his potential, but he only replied that it would be inconvenient to avoid the attacks. Without further ado, he turned to leave. K, however, fully trusted his intuition, and something told him that this boy was different. To clear up any doubts, he decided to test him personally, even if it meant hurting him if he was wrong. But as soon as he tried to attack him, the young man easily dodged. At that moment, K knew his intuition was right. The boy was a potential monster. He asked if he wanted to learn boxing, and the boy, before answering, wanted to know if hitting people was fun. The trainer noticed the dangerous glint in his eyes. He didn't care about fame or money. He was driven by something darker. There were only 2 explanations for that. Either he had always had everything he wanted, or he came from the worst possible background. It was then that K honestly replied that, yes, fighting was fun. He said that humans are easy to understand because brute force is the most direct way to show who is in control. And it is precisely this kind of power that awakens euphoria in the crowds. He explained that the true meaning of life is discovering one's own worth and seeing how far one can go. And so, the coach decided to give you his first boxing lesson. Calm but imposing, K warned that he would only stay at the academy for a month, enough time for the young man to make a decision about his future. Meanwhile, Bandrio's tyranny continued. In a classroom, another victim of Bunnan suffered in silence. His name was Jay, an insecure boy who was constantly humiliated and assaulted by Bike and his group. During physical education class, Jay tried to talk to the protagonist, saying how much he hated soccer and sharing his dreams for the future. For the first time, he felt he had found a friend, something Bike couldn't allow. For him, the victim should remain submissive. None of them could escape his control. But something changed that day. Bon couldn't accept anyone interfering with his plans. If he wanted to maintain control, he needed to prove who was really in charge. Anyone who challenged him would only know pain and suffering. After class, Yu walked calmly home, while Jay, gripped by fear, could barely breathe. Since childhood, he had learned that the strongest always rule, and the weak only obey. In his mind, there was nothing he could do to change that. As he walked, Yu noticed Bon waiting for him. Feeling that his previous message hadn't been enough, the bully went after him to teach him what a real punch was. Yu showed no interest in reacting, which only enraged his aggressor. Even after being knocked down, his eyes remained expressionless. Seeing that the boy was not intimidated, Bon ordered him to get money by the next day or suffer the consequences. Shortly after, as he was leaving the place, the bully himself was intercepted by a rival gang, whose leader he ended up knocking out with a single blow. Bake was a wild animal, someone who didn't care who he hurt. Yu, in contrast, was calm on the outside, but inside there was something far more dangerous. The next morning, Jay got ready for school as usual, but after a conversation with his father, he decided things would be different that day. During class, he noticed that the bullies were strangely quiet and wanted to find out why. He soon realized that the protagonist had used his accomplices as punching bags for not obeying an order. It was the punishment they deserved. Filled with courage, Jay asked them to stop. His voice sounded firm, though he himself didn't know where he'd found so much boldness. If he'd decided to change, this was the moment to prove it. Bake watched everything with a satisfied smile. Finally, his puppet was starting to react. What nobody knew was that Jay had been training in boxing since childhood, under the guidance of his father, a former fighter. After landing a direct punch and a well-aimed slap, he felt a flash of confidence. One of the aggressors even began to tremble. Seeing this, Bake decided to face him personally to test how far the boy could go. Jay went on the attack, but none of his blows hit the target. His lack of experience was evident. However, in a brief moment of luck and technique, he managed to land a precise punch. For Bake, that fight was just a pastime. He knew Jay had dreamed of getting revenge for a long time, but they were on completely different levels. Jay realized this, and despair threatened to overwhelm him. Still, memories of his father, who never gave up in the ring, inspired him to continue. Bake, for his part, was pleased to see that the boy showed a modicum of courage. His gaze changed. He no longer saw before him a mere weakling, but someone willing to fight. Determined, he began to attack with real force. The blows landed one after another on Jay, but he remained firm, protecting himself as much as possible. Bake was breathless from the onslaught, and that's when Jay saw his chance. He retaliated with everything he had, but fell right into his opponent's trap. Jay had always admired his father. Perhaps he had never won major titles, but he was a tireless man who gave his all in every fight. Jay wanted to be at least half the man he was. That's why, even when injured, he would keep getting up every time he fell, even if the result was the same. No matter how many times the veteran is knocked down, he always remembers the lesson he learned from his father. A true boxer gets up as many times as necessary to achieve victory. Bicken, tired of so much confidence, believes the game is over for them. He will knock him down as many times as necessary until he reminds him of the failure he believes himself to be. However, Jay tells Baxon that he never intended to win. What he really wanted was to stop being the coward who was always afraid of a simple gang member who imagines himself the king of the world. In his thoughts, Jay assures himself that he will never again be afraid of that man. Baxon, consumed by rage, decides he will not allow his authority to be mocked. But what the bully couldn't foresee is that the protagonist was already tired of watching that ridiculous spectacle. Meanwhile, Ka is questioned about his thoughts on the protagonist. He replies with conviction that he has always trusted his intuition. When he observes a boy, he can tell if he has what it takes to rule the world. And it was exactly that feeling that overwhelmed him when he sensed Bond's presence. However, what he saw in you was something different. For the first time, he felt the true meaning of fear. Even now, shivers run through his body when he remembers that moment. The memory still haunted him. Yu's cold gaze conveyed boredom as he awaited the blows, something completely unusual in a human being. Anyone would feel dread at the idea of being hit, but not him. Intrigued, Ka felt the need to test his theory. So, when he launched a blow that could have been fatal, the boy dodged with impressive ease. To him, it was clear that boy was unique. For the first time in his life, Bicken felt nervous, and as he tried to end the fight, he was counterattacked in the blink of an eye. Ka explained to Yu that time seemed to flow differently for that boy, as if everything around him happened in slow motion. He stated that the protagonist couldn't be called a genius, as he didn't even seem human. In his words, "He's a monster." Baxon, confused, didn't understand what was happening. He always had a natural talent for fighting, so much so that anyone who challenged him ended up on the ground, injured and defeated. This always gave him a feeling of pleasure that was difficult to describe. As the years passed, his fame grew, and he began to consider himself superior to everyone. But everything changed that day when he met that boy. He wondered how someone recognized as a genius, even by the best coach in the world, could lose to a mere talent. The answer, he thought, was nobody. Determined, Ryu vowed to demonstrate all his strength, even if it meant eliminating that despicable insect. It was, after all, a gift bestowed by the gods. However, Gu had received something that surpassed any divine blessing, a power that stood out above all others. Ryu had to accept that he was just an uncrowned king atop a small mountain, unable to see the much larger world beyond him. When the bully awoke hours later in the hospital, a new feeling began to take hold of him. It was the bitter sensation of defeat. At 17, Bikarawa cried like the 5-year-old boy he once was. Meanwhile, Kat, tired of wasting time with useless newcomers, decided it was time to pursue something he had previously considered impossible. And, as if fate had conspired in his favor, the protagonist entered his gym. Ka smiled, believing his prayers had been answered. The coach asked Yu if he had finally decided to accept his offer. Yu replied that he had, but imposed a condition. He would only accompany him if he could pay a hospital bill. Kei, curious, asked if Ryu had been a worthy opponent. Upon hearing that he hadn't, he laughed loudly and asked him to accompany him to the hospital. Inside the clinic, he was astonished by Bonen's condition. He knew Ryu was a prodigy, but he never imagined he would end up like that. Meanwhile, Yu also went to visit his friend Jay. As soon as he met him, he realized it was time to leave. Kot, observing the miserable life of his new student, stated that as soon as he sorted out the paperwork, he would return to fetch him. This would be the beginning of a new journey, where some were born for greatness and others were destined to be forgotten. In this cruel and unequal world, only the will of the courageous prevails, and it is they who must keep their heads held high. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The protagonists were ready to begin a new adventure. However, noticing how disheveled Yu was, Ka decided to give him a complete makeover so that, as soon as the flight ended, they would be greeted by the coach's team looking sharp. There, they met Patrick, the man, and Carmen, the woman. The young woman was intrigued to discover that this was the boss's new pupil. After collecting the boy's luggage, they decided to take him to what would now be his new home, a place completely different from the old hole where he lived. But there was no time to lose. Ka took him straight to his gym, the Leon Boxing Club, home to countless world champions he had trained. Each one was special, but the heavyweight champion, Aaron Tai, was the greatest of them all. However, for some personal reasons, he had decided to change gyms. Kat explained to his pupil that he still had much to learn before reaching the level of a champion. However, among all the lessons, he needed to understand that there were other monsters like him in the world. As his first task, he was to learn about boxing from Aaron Tig, the champion who, with brute force alone, was capable of knocking out the #1 ranked fighter in just a few punches. The fight never went to the second round, and he remained undefeated. Ka tried to teach the protagonist the value of fame, saying that one day everyone would shout his name, and that he, as his trainer, would be responsible for transforming him into the future king of the sport. For Ka, this was the moment he had waited for his whole life, and his greatest desire was finally beginning to come true. Night fell, but Yu couldn't sleep. The ghosts of his childhood continued to haunt him, though his best friend made the pain more bearable. The next morning, at the academy, Ka was confronted by one of his students, a young redhead named Josh. Marginalized by the coach, Josh was given one last chance. If he could defeat Yu, he would become world champion. The news spread quickly among the students, but no one believed in his chances. Everyone knew that Ka's pupils were geniuses, almost invincible. Josh was seen as just another unimportant face, easily replaceable. So he saw that fight as his last chance to prove he was worth something. Even though he looked weak, one of the most experienced boxers commented that Ka always chose someone who exceeded all expectations. The coach decided it was the perfect moment to give the protagonist his first lesson. He said that, from that day until the end of his career, he should never allow himself to be hit. That would be all the instruction for the first round. So, when the bell rang, Josh went all out, determined to win. His reflexes were incredible, and if it were up to Ka, he would already be among the professionals. However, it was still too early. After a few seconds, Josh was exhausted, while Yu remained motionless, without even breaking a sweat. The boy finally understood why the coach was so confident. From the beginning, he had placed an insurmountable barrier before him. In the past, Josh had been proud of his abilities, but now he clearly saw the difference between himself and this new opponent. He was the most diligent student in the entire academy. In his view, those who worked harder than others were destined for glory, just like the great champions of the past. But one question tormented him. Why did life insist on being so unfair to him? Kay recognized that Josh possessed certain remarkable qualities, but none of them were enough to overcome Yu. Nothing could withstand such immense talent. But that didn't mean he should consider himself useless. The fight was nearing its end, and Kay decided to teach the protagonist his second lesson. He said that anyone thrown against the ropes would fall unconscious. In other words, boxing came down to two things: dodging well and striking with precision. The instructions were simple, yet many spent their entire lives trying to perfect them. Geniuses, however, were different. They moved in unique ways, and they weren't given orders, only objectives. They were the pinnacle of boxing, the highest point a human being could reach. Josh recognized in his mind that his opponent was formidable, but he believed his experience might give him an advantage. If he could prolong the fight, he would win. He just needed to hold out until then. However, his entire plan crumbled in the blink of an eye. When Josh regained consciousness, the fight was already over. Along with all his hopes of continuing in the sport, Yu tried to smooth things over by offering him a rematch. But the redhead's wounded pride couldn't bear another humiliation, and before the protagonist could leave, Josh called him back. He needed to ask a question. He said he'd heard rumors about another fighter who had caught Kay's attention and wanted to know if that man was also stronger than him. Hearing his opponent's question, Yu thought of Jay, his friend, instead of Bon, and calmly replied that probably yes. Leaving him, Yu went his own way, while Josh made the decision to abandon boxing forever. Years passed, and now, in New York City, known as the Big Apple, was Peter Kent, the world's most renowned boxing reporter, closely following Yu's progress. He could hardly wait to meet the next champion, the one who had been training hard under Kay's tutelage. All the dedication to the new routine had sculpted a strong and defined body. And finally, the moment for his professional debut had arrived. His opponent would be John Taker, nicknamed the Rookie Killer. Despite not having the best professional record, he was feared for having caused the deaths of countless young talents. His close quarters fighting style and treacherous tactics made him a real threat. Peter watched John's every move intently, noticing his peculiar training method, the rear naked choke, a dirty technique that allowed him to deliver strikes disguised as a clinch. John's trainer approached and announced that there were visitors. After training, John commented that he had never been interviewed before, so he believed his next victim would be someone famous. He laughed at himself, saying that regardless of who the opponent was, the result would always be the same. Just imagining it made him start to lose control. Peter found it curious how he seemed to relish the villain role. The memory made him think of the middleweight champion, Fabricio Santorino, known for his sadism, a comparison that, for John, was a compliment. The Santorinos were a respected family in the sport, and Peter felt excited. The World Boxing Council had planned everything perfectly, choosing the ideal showman for the new star's debut. However, behind that arrogant appearance, there was another side to John. The day of the fight arrived, and as he walked to the ring, he wore a tense and hesitant expression. Deep down, he didn't like what he did. His job had always been to defeat newcomers, and to do that, he needed to get into character. At the commentary table, Martinelli, a sports expert, was on the left, while on the right was Bob Norris, a former world champion. The fight was about to begin. The fighters entered the ring, and you couldn't help but admire the glamour of the international stage. His debut, after only 2 years of training, was already attracting worldwide attention. The crowd wondered, would John Taker secure another victory against a rookie? Or would Yu prove himself worthy of Kay's reputation? The fight between the rookie killer and the boxing prodigy was about to begin. As soon as the referee gave the signal, John planned his first attack right after the glove touch. However, in a matter of seconds, his smile vanished. Yu's cold gaze filled him with deep fear. It was as if his own life was in danger. He thought taking the initiative would be the best choice. But a simple move by his opponent made him understand, and not only him, but all the experts present, that a true monster had emerged to claim the throne. John didn't understand what had just happened. The ring was covered in blood, and the referee had to stop the fight. The doctor, experienced in more than 20 years of practice, had never seen such serious injuries in a ring. The injuries John had suffered were clear and frightening. The idea that a young man could cause so much damage in such a short time seemed unimaginable. John could barely hear the instructions. His mind was taking him back to old traumas. But when he came to his senses, he insisted to the referee to continue, and however absurd it seemed, the fight restarted. Perhaps the first blow had caught him off guard, but as soon as he tried to get up, Yu delivered another devastating attack. The fight turned into a one-sided massacre. The audience witnessed a brutal spectacle, and Yu, focused, believed he would finish the fight with the next blow. A miracle, however, occurred. John dodged by millimeters, and, even staggering, resisted. Blood spread further and further across the floor, and the audience went wild at the scene. Yu's violence and absolute control caused shock and fascination. No one could believe that Kei had actually brought a demon into the ring. John tried to step on Yu's foot, seeking to close the distance. But the protagonist saw everything clearly. John's trainer shouted that there was still one last chance. If he used his special move, perhaps he could close the distance and land a punch capable of knocking anyone down. But the audience didn't seem to want that. They wanted to see the villain defeated. They shouted and booed John, while his worried trainer wondered if he was okay with the situation. The truth is that John Taker had been an honest man. He always maintained a loyal relationship with his trainer, even when the old man mocked his limitations. He supported him at all times, including when his career seemed to have come to an end. John remembered the day he faced Isaac Dressner, a young prodigy making his professional debut. He knew he had no chance against him, but even as the underdog, he vowed to put on a great show, even if it was his last fight. As expected, Isaac cornered him against the ropes. John, however, was not one to give up easily. Since childhood, he had learned that the world was made up of predators and prey, and that surviving meant fighting with all his might. His entire life had been a battle. He remembered his mentors and thought that, without them, his destiny would have been completely different. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps destiny. In a moment of desperation, his arm wrapped around Isaac's neck, and it was at that moment that the move that would mark his career was born. At the gym, he was the most dedicated of all. He firmly believed that whoever strives harder than others is destined for glory, like the great champions. Even so, he couldn't understand why life seemed so unfair to him. Carr recognized that Josh had some qualities, but in none of them could he surpass Yu. There was nothing that compared to such overwhelming talent. Although that didn't mean he should feel completely useless. His coach, however, continued to believe in his potential and insisted that he never give up. John caught his breath. He knew his talent was limited, but he also knew he would never abandon the ring as long as he had the support of his coach, the figure he considered a father. And when he executed his special move, time seemed to stop. Yu reacted quickly and counterattacked with superhuman precision, fracturing John Taker's wrist. The fight was over. The protagonist landed a straight punch to his opponent's face, knocking him to the canvas. While the referee began the count, John's coach shouted for him not to give up. He said he should never consider himself disposable, because he was worth as much as any other boxer, perhaps even more. John, on the verge of losing consciousness, whispered to his trainer not to worry. He thanked him for everything he had learned and stated that there was no reason to panic. From the day their paths crossed and he received a second chance, it was thanks to that man that he was able to change his destiny. However, no matter how much he wanted to continue, his body no longer responded. Thus, the fight came to an end, with the undeniable victory of the young demon who had just been born into the world of boxing. The audience erupted in applause, celebrating the most impressive debut they had ever witnessed. Peter Kent, experienced as few others, analyzed the result with a clinical eye. In his entire career as a sports journalist, he had never seen such a precise counterpunch. The young man had aimed exactly at the most vulnerable point of Taker's hand. His speed and technique surpassed human limits. Peter concluded that Kei had met the strongest of them, all a rookie destined to challenge the top of the world. When a giant emerges, he inevitably transforms the destiny of everyone around him. A few weeks earlier, Kasim had appeared at a gym, saying he would become world champion. His trainer thought it was a joke until the redhead defeated all the fighters in the gym. His style was extraordinary, almost as if he had come out of a video game. With an impeccable physique and a natural instinct, Kasem quickly transformed into a beast. The next day, he went to Kei's gym looking for trouble. He wanted to see his future rival face to face. Kei took the opportunity to assess him, carefully observing his physique. His hypothesis was correct. Kasem possessed a powerful body, but was still a cub compared to Eren Tight. There was no reason to fear him. On the contrary, it would be a pleasure to see him destroyed. Kei told the redhead that you had gone for a run, and while the protagonist was training, he was ambushed by Kasem, who tried to attack him from behind. You reacted instantly, but, to his surprise, the blow was blocked. Kasem taunted him, stating that no one would be able to touch him, and promised to prove it in their next fight. A short time later, the long-awaited fight began. Kasem cornered his opponent against the ropes, and no matter how hard the other tried to defend himself, it was useless against the beast's brutal strength. With a decisive blow, the challenger fell to the canvas, and Kasem was declared the winner. Before the fight ended, his rival, still fallen, warned him he should take boxing seriously, otherwise he would end up like him, defeated and forgotten. But that didn't seem to matter. Kasem had become the center of attention, dividing the boxing world in two. Some admired him for his daring style and striking appearance, while others considered him just a lucky showman. Even so, most couldn't deny the feeling that Kasem was born to reach the top and claim the throne as king of boxing. Kei, on the other hand, watched everything with satisfaction. He knew that, despite all the redhead's arrogance, this fight would be a great test for his pupil. He ordered you to take the confrontation seriously, as Kasem would be the strongest opponent he had ever faced. It was time to show the world what he was truly capable of. The day of the fight finally arrived. Janier was in the front row, attentive to every detail. His eyes, however, were not fixed on Kasem, but on you, the young man whose presence already made the audience tremble. The referee announced the start of the fight. Kasem began by provoking, throwing arrogant words and deliberately lowering his guard, trying to lure you into a trap. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. The protagonist's speed was simply unbelievable. On other occasions, you usually held back his strength to put on a show for the audience. But that day, he decided to fight without reservations. Kasem barely managed to dodge a devastating blow. Kei observed and explained, only two types of people could deliver a truly deadly blow: those who move at a different pace from the rest of the world and those guided by wild instincts. Kasem, even reacting purely by reflex, contracted every muscle in his body to try to lessen the impact. But it was useless. His defined physique was nothing more than a perfect target for his opponent. With each passing second, his confidence vanished. The audience, previously divided, began to laugh and mock him. The pressure mounted, the fear grew, and arrogance gave way to despair. Kasem tried to improvise a strategy to resist, but ended up being completely overwhelmed. Stunned, he staggered to the ropes, while Kei watched expressionlessly, aware that his student didn't need help. When he realized there was no way out, Kasem, overcome by panic, simply fled the ring. The audience was in shock. The judges declared you the winner by submission. His previous opponent's prophecy had been fulfilled. No trace of pride remained in the redhead, only tears and shame as he left the arena. From that day on, no one ever saw him compete again. As time passed, you faced the greatest challenge of his life. His next opponent, a boxer named Neckerman, would be the only one in history capable of landing a blow on him. He was a formidable rival, whose determination rivaled that of a beast. Exhaustion began to overwhelm you, and Kei, realizing that his student was reaching his limit, ordered him to rest for a while. Every fighter, even the strongest, needs a moment to breathe and recover. The problem was that you never learned to relax. The weight of his memories, the scars of the past, and the thirst for victory still haunted him, reminding him that, even among monsters, he was the most human of them all. Nothing on television can hold his attention, even when he tries to distract himself with something different, like playing table hockey against the best player in the United States. You feels a profound boredom that seems impossible to overcome. Later, in the park, he observes a family with such intensity that he can barely look away. The warmth and joy they radiate awaken an old desire in him to one day be able to feel something like that. Still, not everything is empty. a boy approaches, shyly, asking the protagonist for an autograph. It's the first time anyone has done this. Yu, without even having a defined signature, decides to improvise and give the first autograph of his life. The boy, curious, asks what it feels like to be so strong. Yu simply thinks that there's nothing special about it and calmly replies that strength doesn't change anyone's destiny, because, in the end, everyone dies. Later, as night falls and he walks home alone, the thought doesn't leave him. It all seems very familiar, almost like reliving the feelings he had in his youth. Now, however, what truly matters to Yu is that his cat lives as long as possible. That little animal has been his only companion since childhood, the only one who has never left him. In another part of the city, at an academy, Yu's first true rival prepares to take his next fight seriously. Jean-Pierre, a man accustomed to living in luxury, tries to concentrate while his sweet wife, already tired, complains about seeing him so distant. Even hearing her words, the champion remains immersed in thought, intrigued by the identity of his next opponent. Meanwhile, Carmen, during a rare break from work, can't stop thinking about Yu. Since the day she met him, all he does is work out relentlessly. Nothing seems to bring him joy. Well, except his cat, which is the only remaining source of serenity in his life. In Carmen's eyes, he and the champion share similar traits: the same stubbornness, the same emptiness disguised as determination. And even if Yu achieves the title of new champion, she doubts that will be enough to make him happy. At the champion's gym, the coach watches with concern. Lately, Jean-Pierre has been spending more time meditating than training, and his physical conditioning is starting to decline. Still, everyone acknowledges he has enough power to knock out 3 opponents in a row effortlessly. At Lion's Gym, CES recommends his pupil study the champion closely. In today's world, there are only 5 comparable fighters: lightweight Yuto Taqueda, middleweight Fabricio Santorino, cruiserweight Victor Grigoriev, and at the top, heavyweight Aaron Tig. But among them all, Jean-Pierre is the only one who has maintained an undefeated record for 10 years. His style is centered on maintaining distance. The reach of his strikes is so great that it reduces his opponent's field of vision, controlling the pace of the fight from beginning to end. Yu is about to face a true technical expert, whose jab has the precision of a fencing thrust. No matter how much effort is put into closing the distance, Jean-Pierre always finds a way. Furthermore, he is ambidextrous, easily alternating between his left and right stances. Each of his movements seems calculated, and his fights are flawless in every aspect. Even so, deep down, the champion feels he hasn't yet reached the perfection he so desperately seeks. If he wants to keep the belt, he will need to achieve it before facing Yu. Kei watches closely, curious to discover how far his apprentice can go against someone so monstrous. But he's not the only one studying him. Jean-Pierre, the more he watches the fight between Yu and Kasim, the more meticulously he analyzes each muscle tension of the protagonist before launching a blow. For him, that display was a true work of art. The problem is that such obsession begins to dominate him. Each day, he becomes more distracted, and his wife loses patience. The champion, in turn, feels irritated by her complaints, finding it all a tiresome conversation that only distracts him from his focus. Time passes, and a new interview with Peter Kent is scheduled. The reporter wants to better understand this idea of perfection that Jean-Pierre pursues so intensely. The coach simply says that he needs to experience it for himself. At that moment, the champion is in the midst of meditation. Peter had heard stories about him, rumors that the man remained motionless for hours, moving only millimeters from one moment to the next, as if he spent the entire day preparing a single strike. The reporter always doubted it, but the intensity of that practice makes him reconsider. The coach explains that the champion's goal is not to relax, but to channel every extreme stimulus that the body can withstand, living in a continuous state of alertness. To understand, Peter decides to try. He is instructed to empty his mind and focus only on his own heartbeat. If a beginner can feel something like this, he thinks, what would a master be capable of achieving? Jean-Pierre, in full meditation, feels every muscle, every cell, every synapse in perfect harmony. His mind and body become one. He pursues absolute excellence, seeking to surpass the limits of technique. When night falls, the champion ends his meditation with an exhausted body, but a mind sharper than ever. This time, he meditated longer because everything he had learned so far seemed useless against you. He needed something beyond technique, he needed an intense experience. Something that would force him to see the world between life and death. So, he orders his training partners to attack him with full force. But even wounded, Jean-Pierre easily defeats them. The plan fails because none of them have the killer instinct necessary to push him to the limit. For the champion, boxing is an art that seeks absolute beauty. His body must be a perfect work of art, and the belt is the ultimate symbol of that perfection. The object he relentlessly pursues. From the day he saw you fight, Jean-Pierre recognized that the perfection he so desperately sought existed before him. Therefore, he needed to elevate himself. Training with friends was no longer enough. He wanted to feel real danger, pure risk, and the new method begins to take effect. So, in the most dangerous areas of the city, he seeks out the local mafia boss. He confronts armed men who could kill him without hesitation. Yet, he defeats them all. The difference is that, this time, he feels truly alive. When he faces the cold barrel of a gun, his body enters a pure state of adrenaline. For the first time, he feels every cell pulsing, every muscle responding to its limit. Finally, he finds what he has been searching for. Later, back at the mansion, he paints with the blood of the criminals, transforming horror into art. It is the way he finds to express what he feels inside the respect and fear in the face of the monster he is about to confront. The following morning, Jean-Pierre arrived at the gym feeling his body vibrate. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins, and he needed to release it before he lost control. After so many days of being paralyzed, he had finally reached the same level as the protagonist. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, his wife sought to drown the weight of her loneliness in glasses of alcohol. Everyone considered her irritating, someone difficult to bear, and, having no one else to turn to, she ended up venting her frustrations to Josh. Meanwhile, Kay intensified Yao's training. He knew the boy needed to be in peak form, ready for any change in strategy. Kay's strictness caught Carmen's attention, and she watched each session with a certain unease. She knew her boss well and knew he was driven by victory. But when it came to Yao, things seemed different. After training, Carmen asked for a moment alone with the boxer. Something had been bothering her since the day she met him. She wanted to understand why he had chosen boxing. The question surprised him. For a moment, Yao seemed to think silently, searching for an answer that perhaps even he didn't know how to formulate. He only said that, seeing a friend fight to protect him. He felt a kind of inspiration difficult to explain. Since then, he had been trying to confirm something within himself, something he didn't yet fully understand. Carmen watched him, unsure what to think. She wondered if he would really be able to find what he was looking for in such a merciless sport. The day before the fight arrived. At the weigh-in and the final face-off, the two boxers' eyes met intensely. Jean-Pierre couldn't completely hide the emotions that overwhelmed him. As soon as the ceremony ended, he called his coach aside and made a request. Under no circumstances should he throw in the towel. If he had to lose his life to find his purpose, so be it. As the day of the fight dawned, the champion felt every detail of the world around him. The touch of the toothbrush bristles, the fabric of his clothes against his skin, everything seemed amplified, as if each sensation existed in perfect harmony. The world was so vivid it bordered on frightening. It was beautiful, but terrifying. Then, the decisive moment arrived. Kay looked at you and declared that the belt would soon be his. On the other side, the coach advised Jean-Pierre to savor every second, for perhaps this was his only chance to achieve the ideal he had always sought. The confrontation began, and Yu was surprised to see an opponent almost hit him. The champion was prepared, totally focused. Kay noticed this immediately and recognized that Jean-Pierre had taken the duel seriously from the start, which made the fight much more interesting than he expected. The champion seemed able to predict Yu's movements. Every time the challenger prepared to attack, Jean-Pierre responded with a precise counter-attack. Still, the reaction time wasn't perfect. Yu managed to escape and, as the commentators would say, the champion showed why he was considered a genius in the ring. Kay admitted to himself that Jean-Pierre was a rare talent, but now he had become something beyond that, a true boxing monster. It was impressive that he had reached such a level through his own effort alone. Even soldiers, accustomed to danger, rarely feel that moment when death seems to approach and time slows down. Humans are born with the potential to surpass their own limits, and when they develop this ability, they become something almost superhuman. In boxing, strength serves to prove one's worth, but if the opponent is weak, that worth is never revealed. Therefore, Jean-Pierre became the ideal opponent for you to show, for the first time, his true potential. Kay wondered what his fighter would do now that the champion had taken control of the fight. He remembered the previous night, when you had told him that he only imitated his opponent's movements, something that intrigued the coach. Kay suggested that he not follow any rigid principles, but listen to his own intuition. Don't copy anyone, Kay thought. Fight your way, think, decide, and trust yourself. Jean-Pierre, alert, analyzed his opponent's posture. He knew that a single mistake could be costly. His mind screamed that if he tried to get too close, he would die. Defense seemed the best choice, but even that had its limits. The audience held their breath when the champion fell to the ring for the first time. It was something unprecedented. You, at last, showed who he really was. Jean-Pierre regained consciousness seconds later to the distant sound of voices around him. The audience watched in shock, and commentator Bob Norris, from his corner, wondered how far this man could go. During the referee's count, the champion reflected. He understood that his opponent was superior in everything. He thought he had reached the same level as him, but realized that Yu's perfection was on another plane, a place he still longed to reach. Even though he was unsteady, Jean-Pierre gathered all his strength and stood up before the count ended. The referee hesitated, worried about the risk of continuing, but the champion's eyes showed no sign of giving up. When asked if he could continue, he firmly replied yes. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. The new round began, and Jean-Pierre knew that if he lost concentration for even a second, it would all be over. He tried to anticipate Yu's movement, believing that simply dodging the first blow would be enough to counterattack. However, even twisting his neck to cushion the impact, he couldn't withstand the absurd force of the incoming punch. His plan failed again. The coach realized that his pupil's body could no longer endure it, but the champion remained standing, driven only by his own madness. The coach didn't understand. What kind of beauty did he see in that fight? Why did he insist on destroying himself? And then, between blows, Jean-Pierre murmured without realizing it, "Fighting you made time disappear." It was too beautiful to watch each movement, each exchange of blows, as if the whole world were reduced to that instant. Soon after, he fell again. The canvas vibrated under the impact, and the crowd erupted in applause for the new champion. As the sound echoed through the arena, Jean-Pierre was immersed in childhood memories. Coming from a broken family, he had always believed that humans were flawed beings. His mother had left him to pursue her own life, and his father, clumsy and powerless, never knew what to do. From there a tragic love was born, and from that love he was born. Since then, he had lived in search of something beyond humanity. He remembered the day his mother left and his father's empty gaze. Now, when the bell rang again, Yu was ready to end the confrontation. But almost miraculously, the round ended before he could. Kay was impressed. It was the first time anyone had lasted an entire round against Yu. The champion's coach, however, demanded the fight be stopped. To him, it was nothing more than a massacre. He wouldn't allow his fighter to be destroyed in front of everyone. Still, Jean-Pierre looked at him and asked in a hoarse voice, "What is life?" He reflected that many live without discovering their purpose, while others die trying to find it, and therefore, no one would stop him from continuing. As a child, he already knew his father intended to abandon him. Now, as an adult, he was determined not to abandon his own destiny. Even the way he presented himself was so disappointing that it was hard not to feel pity. How could a father abandon his own son so coldly? Even though the situation was enough to destroy anyone, Jean-Pierre stood firm. He didn't allow his emotions to control him. At that moment, he decided he would seek the perfection he had never achieved. And, luckily, the being who would surpass his expectations was already before him. It mattered little if that was his last day in the world. In the end, all he wanted was to be sure that his existence had meant something. Jean-Pierre's trainer knew what Yahello intended to do: finish off his opponent. His tactic was based solely on relentless attacks. It was almost impossible to imagine Jean-Pierre leaving there alive. It wouldn't make a difference if Audier arrived later. Since childhood, he had learned from his father what boxing meant and what it was to be a real man. So, he shouldn't act like a monster anymore, but enjoy life and the people close to him, because, in the end, it was his wife who awaited him. But as the fight continued, Mada felt her husband distancing himself more and more. The fight reached its climax, and as the outcome was about to occur, a piercing scream echoed through the stadium. Jean-Pierre's wife wouldn't let him continue. She wouldn't allow her husband to abandon her. The champion froze for a moment. The words she spoke were, in fact, the same ones he had always wanted to say to his father. Jean-Pierre had been, all along, the son who never wanted to be left behind. His wife begged him to stop. There was no longer any reason to continue this fight, especially now that he was going to be a father. At that moment, Jean-Pierre regained his lucidity. He thought about what he had been doing and questioned whether it was really worth pursuing that legendary being or if true love would be enough to fill the void that consumed him. The champion made his decision, remembering the day he lost everything, when a comforting voice asked him if he was all right. Upon seeing an angelic face for the first time, he understood that he had found the most important people in his life. He didn't know when it happened, but in the end, he realized that he too had become clumsy like his parents. Then, the time came to leave the past behind and heal once and for all. The champion left the ring, ending the fight. However, before abandoning boxing, Jean-Pierre needed to perform one last gesture. The fighter, considered the symbol of perfection, personally handed the belt to the new champion. After a decade of dominance, the lightweight title now belonged to you. Later, after the fight, the coach asked his disciple to rest, which led Jean-Pierre to ask his old mentor if he could also be a good father. With a positive answer, someone entered the room. It was his wife, who, overcome with emotion, ran and enveloped him in a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. Thus, with 38 wins and only one loss, Jean-Pierre ended his boxing career.